Thank you very, very much. I'm waiting for the standards of both institutions to fall tonight. I'm sure some of you are ready to leave the hall on hearing that the title of this paper has changed. I'm sure you were expecting a paper on Henry Align revisited yet once again. The granting of McMaster University's charter in 1887 was both a new beginning as well as a culmination of Baptist educational ventures that reached far back into pre-Confederation Canada. The McMaster of 1887, in other words, was, as Professor Charles Johnson has persuasively argued, made up of historical segments from the Canada Baptist College in Montreal, the Canadian Literary Institute in Woodstock, and the Toronto Baptist College and Moulton College of Toronto. But of course, McMaster University was also much more than this. It was also the creation of Senator William McMaster, a native of Tyrone County, Ireland, who had by the 1870s become one of Canada's most influential entrepreneurs and also a leading reform politician. A staunch advocate of the commercial imperialism of Toronto, McMaster used his presidency of the Bank of Commerce to establish a commercial dominion at least the equal of Montreal's. His ardent support of the reform cause of George Brown and Alexander Mackenzie led to McMaster's appointment to the Canadian Senate in 1867. McMaster was more than an unusually successful Canadian entrepreneur and politician. He was also a pious and committed evangelical Baptist who was particularly concerned with doing everything humanly possible to improve the educational standards of his denomination's ministers as well as its lay people. Like many other leading Canadian Baptists in the latter part of the 19th century, McMaster was obsessed with a desperate search for denominational respectability. One important way to achieve this end was the creation of a respectable Baptist university. Another way was to build a Baptist cathedral, the new Jarvis Street Baptist Church, which took ostentatious new Gothic shape under the direction of Senator and Mrs. McMaster in 1876. According to a bitter critic of the McMasters, and I quote, "This large Baptist chapel, Gothic, brownstone, spire pointing upward if not heavenward, marble baptistry, etc., etc., cost $100,000 and odd, and the organ $7,000 besides. And I believe it is all paid for, but it has been built regardless of the needs of the city." One of the members, a senator, very wealthy, married an American. Natural result, they soon had an American minister. Then this new building, also American. Then the lady and the minister lay their heads together and get a professional singer, sort of prima donna. She is paid $300 per year, and many are very much heard about it. There appears to have been a spirit of centralization and aggrandizement about it, which is hateful. The caustic comments of William Davies, the founder of a famous Canadian packing firm, contain a ring of truth. The McMasters were indeed interested in centralization and aggrandizement. In the early 1880s, they tended to think what was good for them was excellent for their less fortunate co-religionists. By 1879, the McMasters and some of their Toronto Baptist friends had come to the conclusion that a Baptist institution of higher learning just had to be built in the capital of Ontario. The Canadian Literary Institute in Woodstock, they had to admit, was more than adequate in terms of its secondary programs. However, they were just as convinced that the CLI's theological department had to be transferred to Toronto since a respectable and progressive Baptist university had no real future in Woodstock. At the 1879 Baptist Convention at Guelph, it was decided, after a very heated debate, with at least an implicit understanding that McMaster money would pay for the new Toronto institution and also significantly subsidize the ongoing Baptist educational effort in Woodstock, that a new theological seminary be established. According to the December 1st, 1880 Act incorporating the Toronto Baptist College, The college was under the control of a board of trustees carefully selected by Senator McMaster and his American-born pastor, the Reverend John Castle. According to the deed of trust, the trustees were, and I quote, "to permit the use and occupation of said buildings for the necessary and proper purposes of a theological college, for the education and training of students preparing for and intending to be engaged in pastoral, evangelical, missionary, or other denominational work in connection with the regular Baptist denomination whereby is intended regular Baptist churches exclusively composed of persons who have been baptized on a personal profession of their faith in Christ, holding and maintaining substantially the following doctrines." It is important to note that the deed of trust does not explicitly state, before listing its strong Calvinist evangelical statement of faith, that those Baptists associated with the new theological college had only to hold and maintain substantially the following doctrines. For some Baptists, even in 1880, substantially meant a number of possible exceptions to the evangelical norm. For others, substantially was not any kind of qualifier, but rather the emphatic underscoring of orthodoxy. The following doctrines were the divine inspiration of the Scriptures, the Old and New Testaments, and their absolute supremacy and sufficiency in matters of faith and practice, the existence of one living and true God, sustaining the personal relation of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the same in essence and equal in attributes. And eventually, a reference was made to that parties so baptized are alone entitled to communion at the Lord's table, and that the gospel church is a body of baptized believers voluntarily associated together for the service of God. What did the December 1st, 1880 deed of trust, which was an integral part of the Toronto Baptist College Act of Incorporation, actually mean? Did it mean that everyone teaching or being taught in the college had to hold substantially to such a statement of faith? No. The widely accepted legal interpretation was quite different. As far as one noted legal expert was concerned, N.W. Rawlyk, the theological tests or requirements set up in the trust deed were not tests or requirements applied to the institution, but were tests or requirements applied to the Baptist denomination entitled to control the university and have its theological students taught there. Therefore, and this point needs to be stressed because of its important implications for McMaster University in the 1920s and perhaps beyond, the only way in which McMaster's institution could be affected by anyone challenging its theological teaching would be by their challenging the theological standing of the Baptist denomination represented and informing the Baptist Convention of Ontario and Quebec. McMaster carefully selected the trustees for the Toronto Baptist College, and these men, on the whole, reflected the senator's commercial and political views. There were leading lawyers, businessmen, and politicians like Alexander Mackenzie, the former Liberal Prime Minister of Canada. What these men seemed to have in common was a tremendous commitment to the Baptist cause in Ontario and Quebec, as well as a profound belief in the efficacy of higher education. Moreover, led and inspired by McMaster, they were preoccupied with the quest for power and influence, not only in Canadian society, but also within their own denomination. By controlling the Baptist Seminary in central Canada, one they hoped would quickly emerge as a national institution for the denomination, they expected to control the entire denomination from the top down. According to Antonio Gramsci, cultural hegemony in a society being transformed by industrial capitalism is characterized by the spontaneous consent given by the great masses of the population to the general direction imposed on social life by the dominant fundamental group. This consent is historically caused by prestige and consequent confidence, which the dominant group enjoys because of its position and function in the world of production, end of quote. For Gramsci, organized religion plays a crucially important role in the actual exercise of power of one group over another. It should not be forgotten that, as Tom Harper has recently pointed out, and I quote, "From one very important point of view, the whole of organized religion is a not too subtle form of power-seeking and control," end of quote. Christian feminists for years have been making this precise point. about misogyny and the power structure of the Christian church. And their analysis and that of Gramsci and his disciples, in my view, can be powerfully applied to the development in the 19th and 20th centuries of the Christian church in North America in general, and to the Baptist denomination in Canada in particular. It is Gramsci's contention that the new class of capitalistic entrepreneurs, the McMasters of this world, concern themselves with the creation of a new strata of intellectuals, whose role it is to win over the traditional strata to support the new social, economic, and political order. For Gramsci, in new societies like that of Canada in the 1880s, the new group of intellectuals are expected to fuse together in a single national crucible with a unitary culture the different forms of culture imported by immigrants of differing national origins. This fusing process facilitates economic growth in a country like Canada and helps to explain why all Protestant churches in Canada in the pre-1914 period were so preoccupied with building an Anglophile and Christian dominion from sea to sea. It was also Gramsci's contention that the new class of intellectuals, including, of course, the religious leaders, are locked into an integrative, symbiotic relationship with the new social order thrown up by the fundamental changes affecting economic production. The intellectual priest thus functions at two levels, which correspond on the one hand to the function of hegemony, which the dominant group exercises throughout society, and on the other hand to that of direct domination, a command exercised through the state. The functions in question are precisely organizational and connective. The intellectuals are the dominant group's deputies, exercising the subaltern functions of social hegemony and control. Thus, if we use the Gramsci-like lens to view unfolding events in the Toronto and Ontario Baptist community in the 1880s, a disconcerting picture suddenly emerges. McMaster and his Baptist business associates may be seen as calculating entrepreneurs determined to create their own battalion of ministerial deputies expertly trained to impose suitable hegemonic order and control over Canadian society. Even though McMaster and his Baptist business associates consider themselves to be staunch protectors of the pristine purity of evangelical Calvinist Baptist orthodoxy, they were also committed advocates of the new North American consumer culture. And because of this, they offered what has been called a new legitimization for the antithesis of Calvinist evangelical orthodoxy, a narcissistic gospel of intense therapeutic self-realization. In the 1880s and 1890s in North America, the leaders of the WASP bourgeoisie, it has been observed, felt cramped, over-civilized, cut off from real life, threatened from without by an ungrateful working class, and from within by their own sense of physical atrophy and spiritual decay. Moreover, the old religious sanctions of the moral life, a life of sacrifice and toil, had begun to disintegrate in the face of both Darwin and the liberalization of Protestantism itself. A crisis of purpose, a yearning for a solid, transcendent framework of meaning was not just Henry Adams' worry, but that of a much wider group. In this time of cultural consternation, the new professional managerial corps appeared with a timely dual message. On the one hand, they preached a new morality that subordinated the old goal of transcendence to new ideals of self-fulfillment and immediate gratification. The late 19th century link between individual hedonism and bureaucratic organization, a link that has been strengthened in the 20th century, marks the point of departure from modern North American consumer culture. The consumer culture is not only the value system that underlies a society saturated by mass-produced and mass-marketed goods, but also a new set of sanctions for the elite control of that society. The inner transformation of North American society is of critical importance to any sophisticated understanding of late 19th and early 20th century historical and theological development. The prevailing Whig scholarly obsession with progress and modernity has meant, among other things, however, that most historians simply assume that by the turn of the century, the North American evangelical consensus was being shattered by three powerful external forces. First, there was Darwin and evolution and the new science. Then there was critical biblical scholarship. And third, there was the impact of comparative religion, which seemed to undermine for many the belief in the uniqueness of Christianity. Without question, these three forces profoundly reshaped the contours of North American Protestantism. Yet, viewing the last 2 centuries as a seamless whole, it may be effectively argued that despite Darwin, higher criticism, and comparative religion, evangelical Christianity, at least at the popular level, is a far more pervasive force in the 1980s than it was in the 1790s. And moreover, careful analysis of church attendance and religiosity have convincingly shown that North American Protestantism was a far more vibrant force in 1900 than it had been in 1800. Nevertheless, the point should be made that 20th century North American evangelicalism was radically different from 19th century evangelicalism. As Martin Marty has persuasively argued in The Irony of It All, North American conservative evangelicals were, in fact, as innovative as their modernist peers, largely because of their uncritical acceptance of the consumer society and all that it represented. The point to be made here is that it may be effectively argued that in the long run, American consumerism had a far greater negative impact on the 19th century evangelical consensus than did the various manifestations of so-called modern scholarship. In other words, a convincing case may be put forward arguing that the evangelical consensus suffered more from internal decay than from external attacks. And at the core of this decay, as D.W. Frank has recently contended, was the cancer of consumerism based on self-indulgence. The testimony of a woman visiting some 80 years ago a department store, the key economic institution of the consumer society, cuts to the heart of the issue. I felt myself overcome little by disorder that can only be compared to that of drunkenness, with a dizziness and excitation that are peculiar to it. I saw things as if through a cloud. Everything stimulated my desire and assumed for me an extraordinary attraction. I felt myself swept along towards them, and I grabbed hold of things without any outside and superior consideration intervening to hold me back. Moreover, I took things at random, useless and worthless articles, as well as useless and expensive articles. It was like a monomania of possession. Other women made similar comments. My head was spinning. I felt completely dizzy. I am just as if I were drunk. These comments were made by middle-class women who had been arrested for shoplifting. They were, it has been observed, an odd foreshadowing of Billy Sunday's contention that alcohol was the cause of virtually all crime. The women's addiction, however, was to consumer gratification. The pathological frenzy to which some women were driven, it is clear, had become simply the seamier side of the new consumer society, where the old virtues of thrift and self-control were giving way to a culture of gratification. These women, in other words, drunk on goods, were striking symbols of the new consumer society. It was virtually impossible for evangelical leaders in the post-1880 period to attack frontally the insidious anti-Christian bias of consumerism. Instead, they became its ardent disciples and enthusiastic advocates of the fundamental goodness of economic growth and technological development. They were certainly unwilling to see what Karl Marx saw in modern bourgeois society in the 1880s and beyond. For Marx, such a society, and I quote, has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, and has in the process become like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the subterranean which he has called up by his spells. Marx then went on, constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social relations, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguished the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast, frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profane. Marx had laid bare the essential nature of life in modernizing society, and he intuitively had realized what had happened to North American evangelicalism. The holy had, in a profound sense, become profane, and all that was solid had melted into nothingness. Few, if any, Central Canadian Baptists in the 1880s would have, or more accurately could have, accepted the validity of Marx's penetrating prophetic insight into the essential nature of bourgeois industrial society. And this was certainly the case with regard to McMaster and his Baptist business associates. Yet, as the 19th century blurred into the 20th, and after McMaster's death in 1887, a few Baptists came to realize that something fundamentally destructive was beginning to undermine the theological and ideological underpinnings of their church and their society. But instead of focusing, as Marx had done, on the distinguishing features of the bourgeois society, or as others had done, the evils of consumerism, these disconcerted Baptists concentrated their concern on what to them was theological modernism, the way in which Darwinian scientific progress in biblical scholarship was significantly altering the older evangelical consensus. These Baptists and their supporters in other Protestant denominations would soon become known as fundamentalists, and their growing obsession with preserving theological purity would be matched by a remarkable degree of violence in thought and language. These people would find it far easier to be judgmental than forgiving, destructive rather than constructive, and confrontational rather than accommodating. But these people, it should be stressed, were not the mainstream of evangelicalism at the turn of the century. They found themselves on one extreme of a broad theological spectrum which stretched all the way to the closed-minded liberalism of some, who in attempting to make Christianity especially relevant to the New Age, made it almost as irrelevant as themselves. At the center of the Baptist theological spectrum was to be found the evangelical mainstream, the vast majority of Baptists, who accepted basic evangelical truths and were not really afraid of modernity. These people felt their religion, or in other words, they experienced it, and they therefore saw no compelling need to intellectualize it. They expected their ministers to preach the old-time gospel, but also to make it relevant to their situation. Between the evangelical mainstream and the liberal extreme were to be found a very influential group that was eager to keep a foot in both camps. Its approach was permeated by an accommodationist spirit, what has been recently referred to as a new hermeneutic based on a double commitment to the biblical faith on the one hand and the modern outlook on the other. Such individuals became the so-called intellectual priests of the emerging Central Canadian Baptist commercial elite. In the 1880 to 1914 period, however, these men were not yet in complete control and found themselves challenged by yet another group, not as accommodating to modernity and somewhat more sympathetic to the theological underpinnings of fundamentalism, but certainly not to its increasing hubris and paranoia. Such individuals, some of whom were academics, were like their fundamentalist friends also fully aware of the contagion of change which was reshaping the boundaries of their society. Their answer to the problem was the careful constructing of intellectual barriers to protect the purity of the faith. But these barriers were put up in such a manner as to permit and to encourage the flow of new ideas. The barriers of the fundamentalists, however, left no space for these ideas. And the liberals, of course, prided themselves in having no barriers whatsoever, apart from their own intellectual arrogance. The fundamentalists, the so-called liberal evangelicals, the conservative evangelicals and the liberals were all concerned about higher education. And within the Central Canadian Baptist community in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the academic battle involved first three groups: the liberal evangelicals, the conservative evangelicals, and the fundamentalists. But with the polarization of the theological debate in the years surrounding the First World War, the educational controversy began to involve only two sets of antagonists: the liberal evangelicals, who were becoming almost more liberal than evangelical, and the fundamentalists, some of whom were former advocates of a more moderate conservative evangelical position. This ideological split, it should be stressed, was buttressed by growing class tensions between the two groups, what Dr. Walter Ellis has described as class war in the churches. Bourgeois liberal respectability was warring against what one Baptist liberal evangelical referred to as fundamentalist bigotry and fanaticism and obscurantism. The perceived class differences existing between the two groups were were superbly captured in a letter written to S.J. Moore, a Toronto Baptist millionaire, in November 1926, by a shrewd observer of the fundamentalist modernist split in the convention. I was impressed by the personnel of the majority, including nearly all the solid elements of the denomination. As the followers of Dr. Shields gathered around him at the close of the meeting to join in their singing and other emotional manifestations, I could not but be impressed by the inferior personnel of the group. I am speaking of the general appearance. It was a simple Manichaean struggle between the solid elements and the inferior personnel, between progress and backwardness, between the past and the future. It is against this richly complex ideological and cultural backdrop that one must view evolving Central Canadian Baptist attitudes towards higher education at the turn of the century. To see the problem within strictly institutional and denominational parameters is to distort significantly historical reality and also to avoid some disconcerting problems relating to essential motivation. The Baptist educational experience, moreover, was not static, but rather dynamic and constantly changing, influenced by people, events, and ideas, but always evolving within the context of what may be regarded as Gramsci reality. Senator McMaster and his Baptist friends were not satisfied for long with merely a theological institute. During the early 1880s, they applied considerable pressure on their co-religionists, and finally, on March the 15th, 1887, a bill was introduced at Queen's Park, uniting the Toronto Baptist College and Woodstock College, incorporating them as McMaster University. On April the 22nd, 1887, the Act of Incorporation became law. And exactly 5 months later, Senator McMaster died on September the 22nd, leaving close to $1 million to his university. The monumental irony of the situation, McMaster University's historian has noted, struck even the most insensitive. At one stroke, the university that McMaster had promoted was instantly financed, but at the cost of his vigor, direction, and inspiration. Section 4 of McMaster University's Act of Incorporation made it clear that the university was definitely a Christian school of learning. It went on, "The study of the Bible or sacred scriptures shall form a part of the course of study taught by the professors, tutors, or masters appointed by the Board of Governors. And no person shall be eligible to the position of chancellor, principal, professor, tutor, or master who is not a member in good standing of an evangelical Christian church. And no person shall be eligible for the position of principal, professor, tutor, or master in the faculty of theology who is not a member in good standing of a regular Baptist church, and the said Board of Governors shall have the right to require such further or other tests as to religious belief as a qualification for any position in the faculty of theology as to the said Board of Governors may seem proper. But no compulsory religious qualification or examination of a denominational character shall be required from or imposed upon any student whatsoever other than in the faculty of theology." It is clear from the 1887 Act of Incorporation that McMaster University was to be a Christian institution and only its seminary was to be explicitly Baptist. There was to be no theological litmus test for McMaster students, but all university teachers and officials were to be evangelical Christians, and the faculty of theology were to be evangelical Baptists, broadly defined, who could be subjected by the Board of Governors to some kind of test as to religious belief. Taking everything into account, the Act in many respects was quite progressive in tone and content, but so much, of course, depended on what was meant by the phrase Christian School of Learning and Evangelical Christian Church. The underlying assumption of the Act, however, was crystal clear. Students at McMaster would be educated by evangelical Christian teachers in a Christian environment so that they would be, and I quote, "thoroughly equipped with all the resources of the best and most liberal culture to enable them to meet the polished shafts of a refined and subtle infidelity," end of quote. The third Chancellor of McMaster University, the Reverend O.C.S. Wallace, enunciated in his inaugural address in 1895 what he must have realized was a strong defense for Christian higher education. He was widely regarded as a staunch defender of the evangelical status quo, but he's also known as somebody very concerned about preparing his students for the challenges of life in the outer world. Though a pious traditionalist, in one sense, Wallace was also, as his later career would show, determined to make Christianity relevant for modern society. He was not opposed, therefore, to a shift in Protestant theology from a preoccupation with salvation in the next world to a concern about certain self-realization in this one. As far as Wallace was concerned, in 1895, McMaster University existed for the teaching rather than the pursuit of truth. Much of the educational work of the present day, he went on, is a menace to all that is holiest in faith and loftiest in morality, because it is molded in form and determined in spirit by the contrary of that principle. Some of Wallace's friends did not accept the new chancellor's point of view. One of them informed him, when once that spirit, that a university exists for the teaching rather than the pursuit of truth, has laid hold of an institution, its zenith has been reached. By the time of his resignation in 1905, Wallace had moved quite a little distance in the direction of his friend's position of encouraging the scientific search for truth in order to make McMaster into, and I quote, a good modern university, end of quote. In his journey, the Nova Scotia-born educator was encouraged by some of his board members as well as some of his faculty, especially those who were scientists. Yet Wallace would never abandon his commitment to the development of a generous and noble Christian character, as he put it. Wallace's successor as chancellor in 1905 was A.C. Mackay, who for years had been the key administrative factotum at McMaster. He played a key role in keeping McMaster a separate educational institution by leading the fight against federation with the University of Toronto. Mackay was enthusiastically committed to the scientific search for truth. He seemed to be amazingly indifferent to the growing theological civil war between so-called liberals and fundamentalists being fought in the convention and in his theology faculty. What came to be known as the Matthews controversy reached a crisis point in 1908 and 9. The critics of Matthews, the Chicago-trained scholar, argued that Matthews was a pernicious modernist determined to destroy the orthodox faith of his theological students. To counter the growing fundamentalist movement in the convention, Mackay saw the need for McMaster's Senate to emphasize the institution's theological orthodoxy, but without abandoning his belief in the efficacy of science and modern scholarship. An investigating committee submitted its report to the Senate on the 29th of May, 1909, and declared Matthews innocent of the charges of unorthodoxy. Though he accepted many of the results of critical scholarship, he nevertheless held firmly, it was said, to the inspiration and supernatural character of the Old and New Testaments. Then the Senate boldly declared, McMaster stands for freedom, for progress, for investigation. At the December 2nd, 1902 Senate meeting, it was agreed that while complete freedom should be accorded in the investigation and discussion of facts, no theory should be taught in the university which fails to give their proper place to supernatural revelation or which would impair in any way the supreme authority of the Lord Jesus Christ. When the Matthews controversy was brought to the floor of the convention in October of 1910, the Senate position was endorsed by a large majority. A leader in this movement to prevent a convention denunciation of McMaster and Matthews was the Reverend T.T. Shields, the minister of Jarvis Street Baptist Church and leading fundamentalist in the convention. Shields probably did not want to alienate in 1910 some of his key church members who were keen supporters of Matthews and Mackay. The Senate response to the Matthews controversy is important in at least two ways with respect to Baptists and higher education in central Canada. First, McMaster's Senate and also the convention explicitly endorsed higher education's key role in bringing about human progress, bourgeois progress. Second, it was emphatically agreed that accommodation was indeed possible between the evangelical consensus and the new scholarship. And moreover, it was contended that McMaster University had a special role in bringing about this accommodation, which for some was merely the articulation of the liberal evangelical point of view. By 1911, Mackay had come to the realization that he was, as he put it, not born to be in the midst of theological controversy. He therefore resigned as chancellor, become principal of a new technical high school in Toronto. Many Baptists were genuinely sorry to see Mackay leave McMaster. Others were not, feeling that he was too soft in modernism and liberalism. They looked for someone a little more spiritual, a little more pious, a little more evangelical to replace him. They saw such a person in Abraham Lincoln McCrimmon. McCrimmon was born in 1865 on a farm a mile north of Delhi in Western Ontario. He graduated from the University of Toronto in 1890 as gold medalist in logic and philosophy. As a student at the university, he excelled not only in his studies but also in athletics. A fine pitcher, he once struck out 12 men consecutively, and it was said, and I quote, that he was one of the first exponents in Ontario of the curveball, end of quote. Very fitting for this evening, of course. When he graduated, therefore, McCrimmon had to choose between Christian service and a career in professional baseball. He gladly chose the former. In 1892, he became classics master at Woodstock College, and 5 years later, he became its principal. While at Woodstock, McCrimmon showed that he possessed one of the finest intellects among the education leaders of America. As a preacher and platform speaker, the former baseball star began to rank with the most polished and forceful orators in the country, it was said. He was widely perceived as an intensely religious and ever zealous Baptist who always sought to convey the message of God in clear and convincing language. Until his death in 1935, McCrimmon regarded himself as an unreconstructed Baptist evangelical, an advocate of soul liberty. He always made the necessity of regeneration the center of my message to a lost world. Moreover, throughout his teaching career, he regarded, as he once put it, my relationship to my students as a sacred relationship. It was based upon mutual confidence and respect and what he called spiritual power. During the 1903-04 academic year, McCrimmon pursued graduate studies at Chicago, and his return to Woodstock, he was appointed, while still principal, college lecturer in political economy at McMaster University. In 1906, he was persuaded to leave Woodstock and join the faculty at McMaster as a full-time professor, occupying the chair of economics, education, and sociology. In 1893, the year after he began teaching at Woodstock College, McCrimmon published a very brief description of his philosophy of Christian education. As far as the then 28-year-old McCrimmon was concerned, the highest type of human character is therefore the Christian character. The ideal for the Christian and for Christian education is Jesus Christ, as revealed in the Word of God. Here we have combined the absolute surrender of individuality and its most intense assertion. 8 years later, McCrimmon developed his educational ideas at much greater length when he spoke at Brandon College on the 1st of October 1901 on the topic Christian education. According to McCrimmon, while it is the inalienable right of every man to have an education, it is the doubly emphasized responsibility for the Christian whose heart should be tender to God's teaching and whose will should be ready and anxious to do his work. Moreover, only Christian education molded the youthful mind in the image of Christ. The Woodstock principle then went on to assert that at the core of Christian education was the person of Christ. For McCrimmon, true Christian education had to, as he expressed it, honor the body and the intellect. Christian education was not only concerned with shaping the minds of students, but also with the condition of the body. McCrimmon's Christian school was definitely not some sort of goody-goody establishment where intellectual powers are at a discount. Rather, the greatest intellects of this world are the intellects of Christian people. It is only the Christian who has the proper motive to instigate him to the fullest development of the mind. It is the Christian alone who is in touch with the fountain of truth. In this age, as in the preceding ones, the Christian teacher is the only safe one. Daily intercourse with Christian teachers was for McCrimmon the most potent influence for making students good moral citizens, even those who refused to become Christians. Yet Christian education had more to it than the development of individual strengths within an evangelical environment. As far as McCrimmon was concerned, the Christian college not only teaches how to develop the life, but also instructs how to give that life for the benefit of mankind. For McCrimmon, Baptist education had a special role to play in creating Christian, Canadian, moral giants, men and women who would tower over their Canadian counterparts and be as cities upon the hill, pointing in the direction of the New Jerusalem. As Chancellor of McMaster from 1911 to 1922, McCrimmon attempted to implement what he called his missionary conception of higher education. He often would refer to the Evangelical Baptist view of Christian education, which has led many of the men who have joined the staff of our colleges to leave even the pastorates, that they might weave their Christian influence in the lives of developing young men and women destined in different callings in life. For him, until his death, the Christian college is the natural and inevitable complement to the Christian home, the church, and the Sunday school. The state schools are worthy of all praise as they direct students to the truth. But after all, any truth is unrelated truth, is truth without its meaning for life, until it is centered in Christ, the Son of God and the God of truth. For Baptists, however, just any Christian college would not do. It would have to be a Baptist institution because of what McCrimmon felt was the crucial significance of the denominational matrix in Christian education. He stressed the fact that our mission in education is with the adolescent in the uncertain years of his youth, when he is trying out his tentatives, striving in this direction and that, criticizing his social and religious relations, seeking his ideals, discovering his life work. It was therefore incumbent upon the Ontario and Quebec Baptist Convention to thrust Christ at the center of McMaster life, so that his creative personality may organize and direct the developing powers. That to accomplish this purpose, there are required Christian teachers, Christian conditions, continuous action of these personalities and conditions, and freedom to exercise such influences. That to furnish this continuous exercise of Christian influence, there must be adequate control, so that there may be as great a guarantee as possible respecting the character of the teachers and the conditions. For McCrimmon, these principles were obviously contained in McMaster University's 1887 Act of Incorporation. He proudly described in 1920 the McMaster he had helped shape into what he called a leading Christian university in this Canada of ours. At McMaster, the unique Baptist blend of pietism, soul liberty, and missionary outreach profoundly influence each student every day. McMaster, as far as McCrimmon was concerned, in theory and in practice, was emphatically not an introverted, morbidly introspective and defensive Baptist Bible college. Rather, for McCrimmon, it was a small Christian university, open to scholarship, yet concerned with the preservation of Christian truth, but always within the context of liberal culture. It is obvious that McMaster had the best of both worlds, orthodox evangelicalism on the one hand, and strenuous thought and specialization on the other. McCrimmon sincerely believed that he could energize McMaster with a potent mix of orthodoxy and innovation. Instead of energizing the institution, however, and using it to strengthen the convention, McCrimmon saw his beloved McMaster University help precipitate in the 1920s a furious denominational civil war from which the convention is still not yet fully recovered. The First World War threatened to destroy McCrimmon's McMaster even before T.T. Shields endeavored to accomplish this end in the 1920s. Despite a myriad of external and internal problems, McCrimmon successfully steered his institution through the war years. In doing so, his already fragile health suffered, and he found himself without the necessary physical and mental strength to deal constructively with the renewed and even more bitter fundamentalist modernist controversy which engulfed the convention and McMaster during the years immediately following the end of hostilities. McCrimmon in 1920 felt compelled to inform his Dean of Arts that, and I quote, "Owing to the persistent character of my sleeplessness and the fiendish delight it takes in making me super nervous over the most trivial matters, it was best that no further university correspondence should be sent to me," end of quote. The Chancellor was immobilized. In 1921, the Senate began to look for a replacement, and in 1922, Howard Primrose Whidden was named the new Chancellor. McCrimmon's illness in 1920 and 21 may have had both physiological and psychological roots. He saw his idealized McMaster being transformed before his very eyes. The small Christian university, intent upon making good pious Baptists, was being transformed by the forces of change unleashed by the war into an increasingly secular institution of higher learning. Science and social sciences were replacing Christian orthodoxy as the primary molders of student minds. McCrimmon found himself increasingly isolated. His conservative theology pushed him in the direction of fundamentalists like T.T. Shields, people he instinctively disliked because of their spiritual hubris and their violent language and their vociferous alienation from the Canadian cultural norm. McCrimmon's deep concern about education and learning pushed him towards those liberal Christians who were increasingly committed to intellectual accommodation at the expense of orthodoxy. It is not surprising that McCrimmon was immobilized in 1920 and 1921, incapable of providing leadership and direction to his much troubled convention and university. On his retirement from the chancellorship, McCrimmon returned to teaching at McMaster. He was president of the Baptist Convention of Ontario and Quebec for 3 terms during the 1921 to 32 period. He also served as vice president of the Baptist World Alliance. When he died in 1935, he was still teaching at McMaster, now located in Hamilton, where he'd seen his small Baptist university transformed into a largely secular university and into an academic outpost of the new industrial order. Abraham Lincoln McCrimmon's obituary in the Canadian Baptist on the 25th of April 35 captured the man as well as any contemporary analysis. According to the Canadian Baptist, the deep secret of his life was found in Christ. That was the center he sought for himself. To that center he sought to lead others. He rejoiced in the intimations and certainties of immortality. How he loved in his classroom discussions to speak of the lines that went out into the unseen. His faith in his Savior was as simple and humble as that of a child. In that faith he lived nobly, he labored fruitfully, and he died triumphantly. Such an obituary could never have been written about H.P. Whidden when he died in 1952. In fact, when his successor, G.P. Gilmore, wrote Whidden's official tribute, there was a remarkable absence of any references to spiritual and religious gifts and attributes. After discussing briefly Whidden's successful defense of McMaster during the turbulent 1920s, Gilmore maintained, and I quote, that graduates remember Howard Primrose Whidden chiefly as a man of striking appearance, unusual dignity, and broad educational outlook. A goodly number of them remember him as a helpful personal friend, for he had a gift of friendship and became the confidant and advisor of many. His staff knew him as a man who chose men and women with care, who inspired faith in the work of a small university, and who guided them more by gentle hints and wise suggestions than by orders or interference. Whidden was born in Antigonish, Nova Scotia in 1870. After graduating from Acadia in 1891, he studied theology at McMaster, where he received his BD degree in 1894. Did further graduate work at Chicago, and then served as a Baptist minister in Morden, Manitoba, and Galt, Ontario. In 1900, he was appointed professor of English and Biblical Literature at Brandon College. Three years later, he accepted a call to the prestigious Northern Baptist Convention Church in Dayton, Ohio, where he served for almost 9 years before returning in 1912 to Brandon as its president. He left Brandon in 23 for McMaster. It should also be noted that he served as a Union Member of Parliament from 1917 to 1921. Whidden, as the Winnipeg Tribune correctly observed on the 28th of June 1939, was very cool and suave and handled pressures extremely well. No matter how sharply he differed from his critics, one never saw him ruffled to the point of sarcasm and unkindness in debate. He was without question a consummate academic politician. A close friend and president of the University of Western Ontario, W. Sherwood Fox, once wrote that Whedon had, since his early Brandon days, revealed a natural flair for administration and the handling of people, end of quote. And as far as Fox was concerned in 1941, Whedon had been chosen as McMaster's chancellor in 1922 because of his administrative gifts and not because of his spirituality. In fact, the evidence suggests that Whedon had definitely moved from a conservative evangelical position in the late 1890s to a liberal Christian position in the 1920s, far beyond McCrimmon's conservative evangelicalism. A persistent and persuasive advocate of modernity and progress, and closely associated with the Ontario business elite, an active Mason, and a committed conservative, Whedon was perceived by many members of McMaster's Board of Governors as just the person to lead the university out of the dark forest of theological backwardness into the mainstream of North American bourgeois success and respectability. McCrimmon, who had tried to walk the knife edge between the 19th century and the 20th by finding his theological bearings in a distant past, had failed to solve McMaster's problems. Perhaps Whedon would, not by looking backwards but forward, his vision unencumbered by embarrassing evangelical outcroppings. Now, Whedon's insensitivity to the fundamentalist critique of McMaster's apparent move towards modernism in the 20s undoubtedly played a key role in bringing about the bitter split in the convention. Whedon, of course, was not responsible for the split. A myriad of complex forces merged in the mid-20s to bring it about. Yet he could have done more to placate the fundamentalists, but probably not enough. Perhaps only the replacement of Whedon by Shields would have persuaded the followers of Shields to remain in the convention. As might have been expected, Whedon said little and wrote little about Christian education. He evidently was far more interested in getting things actually done at McMaster than in talking about what might be done. He was always a pragmatic Nova Scotian, far more concerned with here and now realities than with theories spinning off into the imagination. In his inaugural address given in November of 1923, Chancellor Whedon clearly revealed how his philosophy of education differed from that of his predecessor. It was a brief address and one of the few available statements that Whedon ever published about anything. There were only 11 brief paragraphs in Whedon's speech. The first 7 dealt with his predecessors, McVicker, Rand, Wallace, Mackay, and McCrimmon. There was also a brief mention of the fine Christian idealism and rugged confidence of Senator William McMaster. Then Whedon only very briefly discussed what he referred to as the certain essentials of liberal education. The word Christian, or the word Christ, was not even referred to once in the body of the new Chancellor's speech. It was Whedon's contention that the chief business of the smaller university is to furnish a liberal education. If, as Kant said, man's greatest concern is to know how he shall properly fill his place in the universe and understand what he must be in order to be a man, then education is, as Galsworthy recently said, the sacred concern, indeed the only hope of the nation. Liberal education should seek to relate the individual to his universe. It's noteworthy that Whedon underscored only one sentence in the first section of his speech. Liberal education should seek to relate the individual to the universe. No mention was made of McMaster's motto, "In Christ all things consist." No mention, moreover, was made of truth being centered in Christ. And Whedon was strangely silent about any special aspect of Christian education, either narrowly or broadly defined. After discussing generally the rise of the great newer sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, and geology, Whedon suddenly declared, through these 4, the modern world has largely become what it is. He then went on, as a result of the application of scientific knowledge, the stellar spaces have been measured and brought near. The subtle forces hidden in air and earth and sea have been harnessed and made to serve man's needs. The whole development and structure of material things in past ages is brought within our ken. The life of plant and animal is so much better understood than that human life is conserved in previously unthought of ways. In connection with all this, there's gone on steadily an emancipation of the mind of man with regard to the dominance of the material. Thus for Whedon, the newer sciences and not the Bible, not Christ, not fundamentalism had brought about the modern emancipation of the mind. Scientific knowledge and not evangelical orthodoxy, and not even experiential Christianity, had led to true freedom, the emancipation of the mind. Even though he did not expect that the newer sciences would produce great specialists at McMaster, Whidden nevertheless hoped that they would produce intelligent students aware of the basic rudiments of modern scientific life. But Whidden, building a bridge in his argument to other areas of the university, agreed with Tyndall that it is not through science nor through literature that human nature is made whole, but through a fusion of both. He went on, "We see then how natural it is to urge that in a truly liberal educational program, recognition be given to the study of universal things in human life. The mind of youth must be brought into sympathetic acquaintance with the best there is in the experience of man. There is still need for the classics as well as for modern language and literature. If the coming leaders of thought and action are to know the best that has been thought or said in other days, the old humanities must not be thrown to the discard." The second part of his inaugural address, Whidden underlined one other sentence, a sentence he must have regarded as being especially heavy with meaning. The mind of youth, he stressed, must be brought into sympathetic acquaintance with the best there is in the experience of man, end of quote. Whidden had thrown his knowledge net over the entire experience of man, not only a tiny section of it, and had urged all of his teachers to bring their students into sympathetic acquaintance with the best there was in the experience of man. McMaster's sixth chancellor then concluded his address with a call for a greater interest and awareness of the new humanities. The historical, social, and political sciences, he asserted, must be more vitally understood and set forth if we are rightly to orient the student into his world of citizenship. As Whidden came down from the platform after giving his inaugural address, he was confronted by one of T.T. Shields' lieutenants with a bitter complaint from his chief, not about the address, but about the honorary degree the university had just granted to Dr. William H.P. Faunce, the president of Brown University, and a person Shields regarded as an unreconstructed modernist. The Faunce controversy simmered into 1924, when at the convention of that year, Whidden actually seconded a Shields motion that, and I quote, "This convention relies upon the Senate to exercise care that honorary degrees be not conferred upon religious leaders whose theological views are known to be out of harmony with the cardinal principles of evangelical Christianity," end of quote. After being re-elected to the Board of Governors of McMaster by the 1924 convention, Shields was absolutely certain that he, at last, had the convention modernists on the run. And in particular, he felt that he had cowed Whidden into submission. Shields, however, not for the first time in his life, had completely misread not only the general theological situation, but also the new chancellor. Much to Shields' disgust, on July the 25th, 1925, the McMaster Senate endorsed the appointment of L.H. Marshall, the chair of pastoral theology. As far as Shields was concerned, the English Baptist theologian Marshall was a modernist. His appointment was convincing proof that Whidden and his supporters had, in fact, abandoned evangelical principles. Eventually, the Marshall controversy resulted in a major split in the denomination, and in late 1926, Shields and hundreds of supporters angrily left the convention. It is sometimes forgotten that during the first 3 decades of the 20th century, T.T. Shields probably had a greater impact, however negative, upon McMaster University than any other person. A catalyst for denominational schism and theological warfare, Shields was either loved or hated, respected or detested. There's no middle ground for those who knew the extraordinarily gifted fundamentalist preacher and polemicist. One of his early disciples, Dr. Morley Hall, superbly captured this polarizing tendency in a story he once told about 2 women in the Jarvis Street Baptist Church who were struck by the special effect of a shaft of morning sunshine on the countenance of the Reverend Shields as he piously sat behind his pulpit. One was impressed by the angelic look of her pastor's face, Hall recounted. The other was certain that she saw traces of the demonic. Shields, it seems clear, was in fact both. He was an extraordinary mix of opposites, of love and hate, of gentleness and harshness, of sensibility and callousness. He's referred to by his enemies as a dictator, a hypocrite, as vain and egotistical, as a man without a Christian heart. His friends, however, regarded him as a man of God, devastatingly honest and absolutely selfless. Thomas Todhunter Shields was born in Bristol, England in 1873, the fifth of eight children. His father, originally an Anglican priest, was eventually ordained a Baptist minister and emigrated with his family in 1888 to pastor a small Baptist church in Western Ontario. T.T. Shields, after his conversion in his father's church in 1891, was ordained as a Baptist minister without the benefit of either a college or a seminary education. After serving a number of Baptist churches in Western Ontario, Shields in 1910 was called to the prestigious Jarvis Street pastorate. He remained there until his death in the middle of the 1950s. A brilliant preacher, widely regarded as the Spurgeon of Canada, Shields, since at least the first decade of the 20th century, had serious reservations about McMaster University's special role within the Baptist denomination. Overly sensitive to his own lack of seminary training, Shields resented the way in which McMaster theology graduates leapfrogged into large urban churches over the careers of their less well-educated fellow ministers. According to Shields in his controversial book, The Plot That Failed, certain officials of McMaster University had come to regard the Baptist denomination McMaster's special preserve. Non-McMaster men were tolerated for the doing of rough work, even as the Chinese coolies were used to do rough work on the Western Front in the Great War. Trainloads of coolies passed through Canada, but no one ever supposed that one of them could, by any possibility, become colonel of a regiment or commander of a brigade or of an army, to say nothing of the possibility of one's carrying a field marshal's baton in his knapsack. To my personal knowledge, certain of the faculty of McMaster looked upon non-McMaster men as useful only for preparing dugouts, lighting fires, perhaps for carrying meals to the graduates of McMaster University. Shields, however, did not explain in The Plot That Failed how he had become commander and field marshal at Jarvis Street, despite McMaster's policy regarding, as he put it, the denomination as its own great estate. Nor did Shields explain why he had been awarded an honorary D.D. degree by McMaster in 1918. Shields' view of Christian education in the North American context underwent significant change in the 1920s. This point is sometimes not taken into account by scholars who merely see Shields as a closed-minded fundamentalist whose views on all issues had clicked into firm place by the turn of the century. From 1922 to 1925, for example, Shields was sharply ambivalent about McMaster's educational role. Despite his critique of the denominational imperialism of the institution, Shields nevertheless, until at least 1925, still felt that there was some hope for the institution, provided that Baptist fundamentalists were appointed to its theology department. The Marshall controversy, however, provided Shields with convincing proof that the university and the denomination had irrevocably abandoned its orthodox Christian traditions and had, moreover, destroyed any remaining fundamentalist hope for theological renewal and spiritual revitalization. In the November the 21st, 1922 issue of his Gospel Witness, Shields began his public discussion of McMaster University and Christian education. In a major article entitled, "What About McMaster University?" Shields raised the question of whether the non-theology part of McMaster was in any way serving the denomination. His response was that there was an unanswerable argument for a separate independent Baptist university, but only if in such an institution, and I quote, "vital and vigorous Baptist principles permeated the teaching of all courses." If such was not the case, he felt, it made a great deal of pedagogical and financial sense for Baptist students in arts and science to be sent to secular universities rather than McMaster. The large sums of money saved by the denomination would be far better used to support a vibrant, biblically based seminary. In other articles in the Gospel Witness published late in 1922, Shields developed further his ideas concerning Christian education. For him, the Baptist view is that a Christian is a Christian everywhere and in all things. That if a man confesses that Jesus Christ is Lord, his subjection to Christ will color even his thinking, and that then no matter what subject he may teach, whether it be history or science or language or math or literature or sociology or theology, he will view everything from a Christian standpoint, and there will be a savor of Christ in all his teaching, and his devotion to Christ will compound the principles of the gospel into a precious nard, which will become diffused by his presence until the house is filled with the odor of the ointment, and the very atmosphere becomes charged with spiritual vitality. As had been the case with A.L. McCrimmon in 1920, Shields endorsed the view that the evangelical ideal of Christian education could in fact be realized at McMaster. He therefore argued that any move towards federation with the provincial university was a retrograde step, and all Baptists were urged to prevent it at all possible costs. I will swing over a couple of pages. By November of 1924, Shields' view about McMaster changed yet again. Some of you will remember that in early January of 1924, his concern of McMaster was such that he was organizing special prayer meetings for McMaster University. But by November, his view was changed again. Encouraged by the convention's endorsement of his critique of the Faunce honorary degree and his contention that such degrees should not be conferred upon non-evangelical Christians, he resolved to give McMaster and convention a last chance. The other Shields, apparently seeking compromise, suddenly appeared from the bitter, bloody internecine theological civil war. Shields informed his shocked Toronto Baptist fundamentalist associates on November the 4th, 1924, that he was genuinely, and I quote, sorry if any of his anti-McMaster statements had in fact hurt anybody. He told them that, and I quote, he had given our hand to Whidden as the representative of our educational work. We are prepared to trust him, to follow him, to rely, to use the term in the resolution which he moved and which he seconded, upon him to carry out in spirit and letter, and we all know to be the convention's desire. We therefore, in this public way, Shields expected this letter would be immediately published in the Gospel Witness, pledge our heart and hand to the support of our educational work at McMaster University. All of a sudden, Shields was now sympathetically describing McMaster as our educational work. He obviously felt that the 1924 convention had endorsed his fundamentalist position, that he was therefore in an unprecedented position to gain control once and for all over the institution of McMaster University. He looked forward to the day when his McMaster men would make the old McMaster graduates coolies and servants of the fundamentalist elite. In early of November 24, a euphoric Shields confidently expressed his new vision of Christian education. He first asserted that McMaster, as a Christian university, had to resemble other universities in conforming to the highest standards of scholarship. But it had to be more than this. Our view of the ideal for McMaster, Shields contended, is not that it should be like the State University minus, but like the State University plus. For him, the plus was the Orthodox Christian dynamic. And this dynamic would be provided not only by committed evangelical faculty in McMaster in art, science, and theology, but by a new Baptist Bible training college in connection with McMaster University. Such a Bible college, Shields contended, would transform McMaster. It would bring to its halls, he went on, hundreds of young people who would live every day not with books about the Bible, but with the Bible itself. It would bring to the university a still more spiritual atmosphere than now obtains. For it is impossible that a great host of young people should engage in the study of God's Word without filling the place with prayer and praise. Thus, McMaster University would become more than ever a center of evangelical teaching and evangelistic enthusiasm and effort. Shields was convinced that such a Bible school, which he hoped would be associated in an intimate way with his own church, would strengthen and not weaken McMaster. The Bible training school, he argued, hundreds of students would enlarge their minds and thus be inspired with the desire of higher learning as they would naturally pass from the Bible courses of the college into the regular university courses. Such a Bible school, Shields prophesied, would encourage the fundamentalist Baptists in particular to give the university a place in their hearts and prayers, such as nothing else would do. He knew of many ministers, including himself, would offer their services to the school at a nominal cost, as he put it. Shields' proposal, as might have been expected, fell on deaf ears. He was perceived as a fundamentalist Trojan horse, to coin a phrase, to capture McMaster for the Shields forces. And even Shields, by the summer of 1925, had lost his enthusiasm for it. Moving towards schism, he proposed in late August, a month after the Marshall appointment, to establish his own independent Toronto Baptist Pastors' College, as he called it, based upon what he referred to as the New Testament educational ideal. Christ must be put first, he declared, in direct opposition to the liberal platitudes of Whedon's inaugural address. Early in 1926, the Toronto Baptist Seminary opened its doors to its first students. A short time before, Shields had announced to his supporters that he was at war, as he put it, with McMaster and the convention. Their moderate modernism, as he spitefully called it, and their spirit of the Spanish Inquisition had compelled him to implement in the new year his August 1925 college plan. He equated so-called Baptist liberty with what he called a mild attack of smallpox or of leprosy. By January of 1927, Shields had organized his followers into a separate Baptist organization, the Regular Baptist Missionary and Educational Society of Canada. A short time later, this body was reorganized as the Union of Regular Baptist Churches of Ontario and Quebec. Thus, by 1927, Shields and his supporters had their own seminary, their own separate union, their own newspaper, the Gospel Witness, which had been started in 1922. They therefore possessed a smoothly running parallel Baptist organization to compete with their convention opponents. And by May of 1927, Shields had a university to compete with McMaster, not located in Ontario, but in Iowa, Des Moines University, a financially troubled institution taken over by the Bible Baptist Union of North America, the president of which organization was Shields. Unable to put things right at McMaster, Shields enthusiastically turned to the task of transforming Des Moines into what McMaster had refused to be, what Shields called a great Christian institution of higher learning, absolutely free from the taint of modernism, end of quote. But within 2 years, the Des Moines experiment had proven to be an embarrassing failure as a student revolt and a bitter American reaction against Anglophile Shields resulted in the closing of the university. During the same period, Whedon carefully consolidated his position at McMaster and prepared the way for a move to Hamilton. In 1928, after much discussion, the new McMaster campaign was launched, which resulted 2 years later in the physical reestablishment of McMaster in the west end of the Steel City. Whedon must have been delighted to escape the presence of Shields and also the bitter memories of what one of his associates referred to as the Lovely War. He also must have been pleased to have been given the opportunity to build his kind of Baptist university. If he had lived to see the day when in 1957 the convention cut its official ties with McMaster University, was content eventually with the creation of McMaster Divinity College, Whedon would have been ecstatic indeed. This was the way he was leading McMaster when he led the move to Hamilton in 1930. Whedon would have agreed with his close friend John Gilmore that McMaster had only narrowly escaped being a glorified Woodstock rather than a university. McCrimmon's McMaster, and also that of Shields, was obviously a glorified Woodstock, a Baptist Bible college. The new McMaster, according to Whedon, was a real university, a place where the intellectual deputies of the new dominant class could help to impose on their society hegemonic control and order. Thank you.